So today I am very, very privileged to have Dr. Andreas Michaelides, who holds a PhD in clinical psychology and has spent over a decade merging his expertise in psychology with the technology sector. At Noom, he had not only founded the coaching team, but also scaled it to include more than 3,000 dedicated professionals, myself being one of them, significantly advancing the company's mission and reach. He also established the behavioral science department, contributing to over 50 scholarly papers that have deepened the scientific understanding of behavior change using psychology. Throughout this period, Dr. Andreas' unique blend of psychological expertise and technological insights has been instrumental in shaping Noom's evolution and Noom's success. Beyond his work at Noom, he offers his expertise to various technology companies, applying psychological principles to enhance product design and the user experience. His significant contributions to the field have been recognized in over 300 media pieces, 301 media pieces now, making him a respectful figure in both psychological and tech communities. Andreas, what an absolute pleasure. What an intro.
Podge, it's so great to talk to you today. How are you?
I'm not too bad. It's really good actually just to kind of go through your background and go through your experiences. And I felt like I was almost reliving my Noom journey as well with you when I was reading that out. That was really special. It's cool.
I have to say, I feel the same way. Like, I remember when we first started working together, when you first started, it feels like yesterday, but my gosh, it's been a million years at this point.
A million exciting, turbulent ups, downs. Everything has been included. But it's great. Yeah, you've obviously clearly established yourself when it comes to technology sector. I know you're doing a lot of really cool, innovative stuff at the moment that we definitely will get to touch on. But I'd just like to take it back when kind of I read out your intro. You know, it was really steeped on your past, especially your past at Noom. But I know there's a lot more to you as well. And I'd love to know just where your passion, whether it comes for just clinical psychology, came from, and then like how did that merge with tech? How did all that come about?
It's a great question. You know, I've had a very strange career that I wasn't even able to predict before, but I think it kind of all boils down to, I guess, me as a kid who had these two very different interests. You know, I was always a very empathic person who loved to, you know, talk to people, understand the mind, but I also loved fixing computers and loved everything tech. And, you know, I would spend my adolescent years pulling computers apart and putting them together and fixing them. You know, I was the tech support of anyone that I ever knew. And so that carried through most of my career. And I remember when I was 19 years old, where I was when I decided, hey, do I want to go into something that's IT related, like engineering or something like that? Or do I want to go into psychology? And I remember making the decision to go into psychology and to get the PhD in clinical psych, because it's much harder to start a career in one and then switch over to a PhD later on. So I was like, let me just do as much as I can now to get the sort of the quote unquote, the hard path, you know, done first. And then I could figure out, you know, how to pivot later on. And back then there was no real path for merging the two things. And now there's a much bigger path. But when I started, there was no path. And I really had to figure out a lot of stuff on my own and fail a whole bunch and help to make doors where doors didn't exist back then. So I'm really fortunate to be able to do the two things I really love.
So at the time when you were younger, you had kind of these two keen interests, but yeah, there was, like you said, there was no door, there was no like mixing of the two. So then you had them both separately and you chose, okay, I'll choose the quote unquote difficult path to go first, and then like keep that as an interest.
Yes, keep it as an interest, and also keep it as like, all right, well, if I don't like the psychology, this is a bananas thought. Like if there's at a point in time where I want to pivot, you know, from psychology to something like that, you know, it's easier to pivot with a PhD than it is to pivot and then to go get a PhD later on. I mean, you know, those things are relative. You can do those at any point. There are a lot of people who go get a PhD later on in life. I had classmates who were very much later on in life when I was getting my PhD, but I kind of had this mentality of like, try to do the hard thing first and it's going to be easier down the line. And I think that's always the kind of thing that I live by is like, you know, do the grind first and then try to hopefully things will fall in place later on. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
I'll just do my 8 years or whatever it was of study first, and then I might pivot back into technology.
Correct. yeah, I know. It's interesting. It's very interesting. But I didn't know back then that there was even a world where I could do both. I thought it was very much binary, like do one, do the other. But I remember in grad school, I spent a lot of time in grad school, like trying to techify things. I don't know what's the right way to put it, but I guess techify things, and scoring, for example, of psychological assessments. And I remember one of my favorite aspects of the scoring the psychological assessments was the creating the like software thing that made it score it much faster. One of the exercises they had us do is score everything by hand. And these things take a lot of time to actually score by hand. Now everything is computerized, but these things are very, very time consuming. And I remember thinking, all right, I could spend, like 2 hours scoring this test every single time, or I could spend like 8 hours writing a thing that allows me to score it in 15 seconds going forward. And I would do that. I would literally put in the 8 hours, make the thing. So I've always been drawn to anything, to productionizing or turning things into products using tech. Another thing that's interesting, when I was in grad school, there's this thing that psych students have to do during their training, which is to find an externship program. And an externship is it's like a part-time unpaid experience that you have to go through every year while you're doing your PhD or PsyD in clinical psych. And I think there are externships and other kinds of things as well, but specific for or PhD and PsyD. And when I was in school, there was no centralized knowledge base of all the externship opportunities out there. Like no one knew what was out there, except all the schools had their own binder that was falling apart and very much outdated.
Oh,
so we had these outdated binders of, this program. And then it was really bad. Another thing that I did when I was in grad school was I created this Wikipedia kind of repository for so I asked all my friends in all different programs, I was like, give me your binders, give me your knowledge, your resources, and let me convert that into a repository for this. And that's what I did. And since then, the American Psychological Association adopted that repository, and they use that thing that I created years ago in grad school as what people are using now when they're looking to find an externship. And I love that feeling. That makes me feel so awesome.
Wait. They use a model similar to yours, or they use the model you created?
They've adopted the exact thing, and they're hosting it on the APA website now. And it's the thing that I created a long time ago. I don't know if they've changed. Probably they've changed some stuff when they've implemented it, but it's basically this thing that was hosted on my school's website that everyone in the tri-state area used. And now the American Psychological Association has since taken that and said, yeah, we want to use this. We want to put this on. And I don't know. I love that. I love that feeling. It's so meaningful to make a positive impact for people at scale. I think that's the summary of what really drives me.
Yeah. The amount of effort and time you're saving people as well, is incredible. I do have a question. You mentioned about the manual scoring at the beginning, and I'm just really curious about this as to why it wasn't. Was there some resistance? Is it just a case of that's the way it always was being taught versus I'm just curious about that when it came.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't they have adapted the technology? You said if I spend 8 hours creating that system, it'll do it super quick. I'm curious, was there a learning reason? They feel they want you in the trenches, in the weeds, so you get the most knowledge? Just something that stood out to me.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's kind of all the things. So the biggest reason is because when you're training to be a clinical psychologist, you're really supposed to be the expert in all the things. And so in all the things all the tools that you're actually using, right? And so taking that philosophy, at least the rationale we were given when we were scoring things is that when you hand score things and you do it like that, you get to kind of slow down, understand the assessment in a very different way, see read the manual, understand what goes into each score. And that is really different than actually plugging numbers in and having it spit it out to you, and I'm sure things have adopted, I've changed now and people are learning differently, and we have to be learning differently now because the landscape of education and the world and everything is with AI especially is different. But that was always the rationale that I was given, is that, it kind of forces you to understand the mechanics of the assessment in a very different way.
That does make a bit more sense. And I suppose especially they are wanting people to come out to be complete experts in their field. But we might touch on later about the future. You kind of even mentioned AI too, which I do want to get onto at a slightly later time. But before we do that, just to kind of continue with your career progression, I know you always, even throughout your time at Noom, continued with your clinical psychology practice as well. Yeah. Is there passions behind that? Is it not wanting to get rusty? What were the specific reasons from your point of view?
Yeah, I mean, before coming to Noom, I joined Noom in 2014. Back then, no one knew what Noom was. When I told school people I worked at Noom, I'd have to follow like a 6-minute explanation of what is a Noom and what is a psychologist doing at a Noom. So I say that because back then I actually started my practice, my clinical psychology practice, while at Noom. And the reason I started then was because I realized really early on that I'm doing really cool, unique things that a psychologist who has a passion for tech is doing, and that's really awesome. But I felt I was getting really far from the stuff I went to school from, because most of the stuff I've done at Noom is not stuff I went to school for. It's just candidly, it's not. The biggest, I think, learning that I've applied from schooling to my time at Noom was like I don't want to, for lack of a bit, like work ethic in many ways. Like when you're working to get a PhD, and actually the hardest part of getting a PhD was getting into the program with acceptance rates so low. And I didn't get in the first, year that I applied. It took a while to actually get in. And so I learned how to be like gritty and to work hard and to kind of persevere. And I think that's the thing that I brought with me above and beyond the just like incorporating the psychology stuff. So I realized early on at Noom, I was like, hey, like I'm not using any of the stuff I went to school for. I need to like maintain my skills, but I really loved helping people on a one-on-one basis. And so that's when I started working with people one-on-one. And I still see some patients for therapy now. I see mostly adults with a variety of different sort of concerns. I have a lot of experience working with folks who have a traumatic brain injury. That's become a bit of a specialty for me as well. And that expertise started even before Noom. Before I even went to get my graduate training, I spent many years working with folks who have traumatic brain injuries in very different capacities. I also do a lot of work with kind of college age students who are struggling with completing studies, with, being blocked by a lot of avoidance kind of things, and essentially boils down to some executive functioning sorts of things. But I run the gamut of mostly adults.
Yeah, I do have a follow-up before.
Yeah,
I also
hit
have
me.
a follow-up. What did you mean with regards to teenagers or the students about avoidance?
So I mean by that is there's sometimes students who struggle with completing their studies at school, and many times what you'll see is a student might start a semester due to a set of avoidance kind of coping things. That semester won't turn out the way they want it to turn out, and they're kind of stuck in this perpetual pattern of not being able to graduate and move on with their career goals and things like that. So that's a population that I've done quite a bit of work with.
Yeah, and you just help them kind of unravel their thoughts and try and talk them through that.
Yeah, unravel thoughts, talk through that. But it's also decreasing some of the avoidance, I think, is a big thing. And many times what happens, I think, with all of us is we kind of fall into patterns, and we fall in, and that's not a bad thing. Falling into, I don't say that as like, oh, we fall into patterns. I mean, we do fall into patterns. Everyone does. I do. Everyone does. And we do that for very specific evolutionary and brain efficiency reasons. We have patterns that we fall into, and sometimes those patterns are incredible because they are geared to our success, but other times they bring us further away from where we want to be. And sometimes those patterns are, and sometimes the avoidance that comes with those patterns is hindering. Now, by the way, avoidance is not always bad. Let's say you have a very stressful situation that's coming up, and the stress is a little overloading, but you're employing a little bit of avoidance to cope with that stress so that you can sleep at night. That's a healthy dose of avoidance. But if the avoidance is preventing you from going to class, then potentially it's not super healthy. And actually, it's funny. I don't think I've ever really talked about this. It's strange that we're on this conversation, but I'll go into it because I think it might be
welcome
interesting.
to the podcast. Weird
I love
stuff
it.
happens.
You're awesome, Podge. Really. You're one of my favorite people, seriously. But one thing that's coming up as we're talking is, I think for me, one very meaningful connection I have to this population as well. I don't know if you know this, but I failed out my first semester of college. Very much so. Yeah, first semester of college, I failed out. And for me, the reason I failed out was I spent my first 3 years of high school overseas in another country in Cyprus, where my family's from. I did my first years of high school there, came back to the States, didn't really have the SAT experience that a lot of people had in this country of preparing for a year and then studying. And like, I literally remember studying for the SATs the night before for 5 minutes and going into this and kind of bombing them hard. Then when I went to school, I kind of chose a school that my ex-girlfriend was going to at the time. So I went there, and I kind of figured in my first semester of college that, yeah, I could just kind of do the same stuff I did in high school, which was like do whatever and I'll just get great grades no matter what. And it just turns out that didn't happen. In college, you actually had to work really, 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 really hard. And so I failed out my first semester. The silver lining here, and by the way, everything is, retrospect is, hindsight is 2020. The silver lining was that that's where I met my wife. We failed out together, actually, our first semester of college, and we both kind of came home. I met her when we were there, and, we both failed out together. I came back and then, sort of had my eyes set on clinical psych, and then my wife went on to be an occupational therapist. So yeah, that's kind of that story.
That's a pretty cool story. The way you were describing it, you're saying when we both met, when we both failed out, I was imagining like, do they gather everyone who's failed and like put them into a room?
Yeah.
And be like, out you.
Yeah. It's so funny. I remember where we were. We were together when we opened up our transcripts and looked at our grades. And we both were like, I think there's a problem. I think there's an error with these grades because, this GPA is really low. I think nothing updated here. And then, it was followed by a letter that said, hey, don't come back. So that was great. That was a great lesson. I think in retrospect, it was such a fantastic lesson. I mean, it was hard at the time, obviously, and very disappointing for parents and all that stuff. And it caused a lot of issues in other ways, but it's easy to say that now looking back.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing? Sometimes like the most difficult things like can be like either big lessons or just big moments. Like you said, you met your wife in that moment as well. Like such an amazing life-changing event.
Yes.
It's cool how things work out sometimes like that.
You always look for the silver lining, I guess.
Yeah.
It's great. No, it's great. And it's funny, like on this conversation, last summer, we're driving somewhere and we kind of stopped at that school on our way up to something. And I messaged the dean of the school and I was like, hey, I failed out of your school, like, many, many years ago, but this is where I met my wife. Would you mind if we just like tour the dorm rooms where we kind of met? And so it was cool because the dean said, that's fine. So we actually got like a little tour of the dorm rooms and we showed our kids and it was fun. But yeah, you never know where things are going.
That nostalgia flying. I can just imagine your kids going, but Dad, where are the lecture halls or the schools? And you're like, sure, I don't know. I don't know. I didn't go.
It's funny. Like I have less of an excuse than my wife because I actually did go to class. I guess I thought just going to class would count. It doesn't. Turns out it doesn't. So I actually did go to class. I have less of an excuse for failing. My wife didn't actually go to class that much. But yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
It all worked out fine. And it's interesting you said sometimes that secondary school, like that high school college transition is tough for a lot of people because the one thing I found is like in secondary school or high school, if you're not doing your work, a teacher's like, come on now, Podge, like this, like you need to improve. But when you're in college, there's no one saying, come on out of bed, you got to go to class. It's like the lecturers are like, you do you, like you're paying to come here. It's up.
That's right.
It's up to you. And if you don't,
we don't care if you don't hand in your paper, you're going to fail.
Yeah. It is different. And I even notice here in Ireland, like there is some people, it just like, I don't want to use we sometimes say college mightn't suit you, it's different platform from coming from secondary school into college sometimes and does take some adjusting.
It's a journey. It's really a journey. So I love this population. And it's funny, I didn't sort of seek out when in my training working with this group, but it just sort of works. It's a population that I feel like I've been able to connect and can help quite a bit. So yeah, that's my connection to this patient population.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I love that you're working with people with brain injuries too. Like my own, it's not my personal story, but my cousin and unfortunately he's young, he's only like 18, and he actually had a brain
Yeah.
injury during COVID. He got like an aneurysm. He survived, thank God,
Oh,
but
wow.
just seeing the rehabilitation and how slow it is, and kind of like the frustrations that he might experience as well, but also like the blessing that he's still alive, which is the ultimate thing. It's really difficult. So to see, like, and hear about you working in that space with people suffering from brain injuries too is pretty inspiring. That's good work, and I'm sure it's something that brings you joy as well. It must be tough, but I'm sure it brings you joy.
It does. It brings me a lot of joy. I think it's interesting. Brain injuries are interesting because a brain injury doesn't mean the same thing for two people because the brain is so intricate and it's really custom for everybody. So even the same impact on the same part of the brain is going to have a very different outcome. And I really enjoy working with the population because the changes that you see, the changes are really slow, and improvement can be I find that it's just anecdotally speaking much slower than a person who doesn't have a brain injury because you really have to figure out a lot of different ways of doing the same kinds of stuff. They're kind of this multimodal way of learning using different kind of cues, and I actually lean a little bit more towards technological kind of tools as well, things like that. It's very rewarding personally, helping somebody make a significant change like that. And I also realize that there are not a lot of people out there that I think have this expertise. So it's fun. I enjoy it. I quite enjoy
Let's
it.
if we kind of zoom out and just
Yeah.
let's talk about psychology in general. Like, what are maybe some exciting advancements that you can foresee in the future that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am excited about, I have a very unpopular opinion on this. I am excited about where AI is potentially taking the field of psychology. I think there's a lot of positives that will come from it. First and foremost, I think there's going to be we're going to see it in our training programs with schools where these tools are going to actually help people be better clinicians in ways that we have never seen before. There's a really big difference from clinician to clinician, like very, very, very big difference. I think probably anyone listening here can either knows somebody who had a not so great experience in therapy and probably not so bad experience at therapy. And part of that is, sometimes it's not the chemistry is not right, it's not the right fit. But also part of that is maybe the training as well for different kind of clinicians. And so I think trainings will get better. I think that the big hot button issue for this is related to therapists being afraid that AI is going to take their job. Right now there is this kind of, I see what's happening now with a lot of tech companies are trying to create AI therapists and replace therapists and do that. And I think we're ways away from it. But the way that I see this, and I think this is the major difference, is, I think the estimate for number of mental health professionals needed to each person in this world is like 10,000 to 1. And, I don't see any way in this world that we're ever going to be able to meet the need. And so if you're thinking about this as a problem of one state in America where, it's kind of there's an abundance of mental health professionals, then I think the perception is very narrow. And I think we need to be thinking about it on a global level because there is a global issue, a global crisis when it comes to mental health. And I think AI is one potential promising technology that could solve it to some extent for people who otherwise would never get another person to help them. Never, ever, 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 ever. Now, I'm not saying that it's good the way it is now. I'm saying that in its evolved form, I think it has the potential to actually do this and do this really, really well. I do think, though, that the role of the human within mental health is not going to go away. I think it's going to be a lot more niche. I think it's going to be a lot more specified. I think people will still want to go sit in a room with an actual human and talk to them and connect with them because connection does matter when it comes to therapy and all these things. But this is just going to evolve. It's an evolution of things. And I see this evolution as being something that could potentially heal the world. And one of my favorite analogies is the tractor. when the tractor came out, people were up in arms that it was going to take away their jobs, and it did, but it also had some really good impacts on the world, and changed the distribution of food and the abundance of food, and anyway, so that's my high level overview.
Yeah, one, thank you for the overview. Two, thank you for stealing like four of my questions in one go. That's
Sorry,
pretty impressive. I do have some follow-ups and just maybe some
hit me.
clarifications. Like one question I did have was, do you see people working with an AI therapist like fully? Do you think people will be open to that? And the reason I ask is because my initial inkling
Yeah.
is no, like you need to have a human to human connection and interaction. Like there's something special there, and there is some like scientific stuff behind like interacting socially. But then on the
Totally.
other hand, I chat with ChatGPT and I say thank you and I ask it kindly and I treat it like
I
it's
know.
a person with emotion. So I'm a small bit conflicted myself in thinking like, could I work with an AI therapist in the
Yeah.
future? I'm just curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think about an AI, I don't know if you want to call it a therapist, the AI blank, as part of the model. And I say that very specifically because that takes different forms. It could be a step in a step care model. So the step care model is something that basically changes the intensity of the intervention based on how somebody is responding to something. So potentially, let's say AI, what blank, fill in the blank, is step one, for example, kind of like that first line of defense. And then step two is human. Step three is, more humans kind of thing. And so there's this idea of the step care model that I think it has a place in. Then, you asked the really one of my favorite questions and about can a person actually work with AI to develop a relationship and to get some therapeutic care? And the answer is both yes and no. And so why do I say that? I say that because it's kind of going to be harder for this older generation that is in right now, that is seeing all of this unfold, and we actually have to make the change to overcome a preconceived notion. And already you're doing it, you're already questioning yourself, and that's because you've had a lot of exposure to that and the possibilities. And by the way, I talk to AI all day long as well, and I also say thank you. And but my kids regularly have conversations with Alexa to ask her what to play for music. And so there's this new generation that's coming up right now that is very desensitized to talking to robots and to computers and to all these things. And my kids are probably going to be even more so as the world of robotics changes as well. There's this rush right now to figure out like what's the best humanoid robot that can embed with ChatGPT, like really sort of what looks like scary stuff. But in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it's not going to be scary because we're going to get used to it. And it's going to be, the next generation is not going to seem, it's not going to seem weird. So I can imagine, our kids absolutely forming connections with an AI something that actually does feel therapeutic and actually sort of, operates within the same mechanism in our brain that operates now when we are talking to another human to human. Yeah, I see it. I see it happening. I see it happening over time. So that's why it's yes and no, because it's yes for some and yes over time and no for some and, probably more yes than over time.
Is there anything like terrifies you about the potential of AI developing in this area?
For the most part, I think that most people get scared when they cannot predict the future. All right, think about it. When you cannot predict the future, that is scary. And we can appease our fears about the future when we can make assumptions about the future or we have hypotheses about the future that make us feel better when we're sleeping at night. But if you think about evolutionarily speaking, we need to predict the future to be able to survive and to be able to prevent predators and all that stuff. How can we do things better? So there's a lot of fear about not being able to predict the future, and I can't fully predict the future. I think nobody fully can predict the future. But where I get a little bit shaky and I think about what could happen is this concept of these models, these AI systems that will get to a place of self-improvement. And there's some that hypothesize that this is going to start happening in 2027, and by 2030, 2031, we're going to have AI models that far surpass human intellect, because they'll be able to run individual autonomous experiments without any oversight at all. But, then I'll talk to other people who I know that are actually in the thick of building this technology, like actually working at some companies that are in the thick of actually building the tools I do. And that will say to you, yeah, we're nowhere close to this. Like, not even a little bit. There's no way we can achieve this, kind of thing. So it's really hard to know where we're going to land. But where I start to think a little bit of where I get a little bit scared is this concept of these systems becoming quite a bit smarter than humans. And I don't know if that's all bad. Maybe I'm being naive about this, but it makes it harder for me to predict the future, and therefore it is a little bit more. It's a little scarier, but I think I just need some time to think about it a little bit more, because I do think I do see it a little bit more positive than negative.
Yeah, even when you were just describing like the uncertainty as well, it was giving me a small bit of shivers. But I guess maybe we exaggerated in our minds in terms of like the capacity that AI can have in comparison to like the people working with these AI models, as you said, are kind of like
Yeah.
it's okay, like relax, it'll be fine. One,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say this is something I'm like terrified of, but one thing I do think about is algorithms, and this really just spawned from even recently when I'm trying to
Yeah.
build out this podcast here, and I'm kind of immersed in social media and I'm wanting to put out content, and then I'm seeing things online going, if you want good content, like you have to put out this type of title to like attract
Yeah.
people in and be like it has to be something negative or dramatic, or and it just got me thinking about, as AI develops, like will these algorithms develop in a way that kind of promotes biases in terms of maybe it's like psychological assessments, like certain groups, or biases
Yes.
towards certain treatments. I don't have like fully fleshed out thoughts around it, but just even thinking from that lens, like that kind of scares me. So might it like quote unquote diagnose people or tell people there's something wrong with them just based on some sort of algorithm that's been developed, versus like you mentioned working with people with brain injuries, like it's so complex, like people are just so complex.
Yeah.
Like how do you work with something and someone so complex using a
Uh,
technological model?
Yeah, I think, there are a couple elements of what you're talking about here. There's the element of AI spreading misinformation in general to the mass population. And it's doing that because it knows, we know what people will pay for. Novelty matters, shock value matters. And these are things that marketers are going to exploit. And, right now it's a little bit of the wild, wild west while things get figured out. And and I'll come back to the question about therapy and assessment in a second. But I think about where we're at now as being close to when the internet just came out. And there was a fear of misinformation, and there was a fear of a lot of this stuff now. And so when I think about, let's say, how Google started with all their stuff, and they had very early on or later on a strong value to make sure that the information that they put out there is accurate, is relevant, is right. So for example, when I go to Google now and I type in like my bank name, right? Like, I'm not worried that the first thing I click on is a ghost site spoofing my bank to take my information to then go to the real bank, enter it, and then, do whatever. I'm not worried about that at all. It doesn't even cross my mind. But like, I don't know, 15 years ago, when I saw my bank come up on the first page of Google, I was like, is this really my
Mhm.
bank? Like, is this it? And you hear about scams all the time. And so, with any new technology, the first step is never make it safe. The first step is make it work and make it awesome. And then it's like, all right, let's make it safe and relevant so that we can retain people and, people trust us and that kind of thing. So if I think about the evolution of new technologies, I think the like spreading misinformation stuff is going to come later on as this stuff gets more sophisticated and there's a bigger problem to solve. And I think the problem is obvious, but we're solving it. When it comes to therapy and when it comes to assessment and these kind of things, I can argue that there are some technologies that could do it better than humans. There are things that you might not be able to catch with a human eye, or you might not be able to make 16 different complex connections about someone's behavior or symptoms or whatever that you can do with something that's AI assisted. Now, I think in the beginning for anything, it's going to always be AI assisted assessments where a human checks it over and that kind of thing. I mean, there are people that are, lives already being saved where they're doing scans, radiology scans they're catching breast cancer, for example, because the scans are going through a filter of, an AI check or whatever, and it's flagging things that humans won't flag. And, right now it's like not as great because there's a lot of false positives, but still there is another side of it. Now, I vehemently disagree with just turning ChatGPT into a therapist. That's not what I mean when I say it's going to do something well. I mean that using the technology that's come out now and building something that is therapeutic on top of that or adjacent to that, using that, I think is what it, and it has to be built by experts in this area, by therapists, psychologists, whatever, in addition to a team of people. I think that this is going to happen. Where I take a very strong position on is that this technology should not just be built by anyone, especially if it's going to be used by a clinical population, because you can actually do real harm if you're building something that sounds really cool or sounds like a therapist, but is not actually doing the stuff there. And then when you build it, you got to test it, and you got to test it responsibly to make sure that it's doing the thing that you want it to do in a responsible and safe way. I just have a more optimistic view on it, that we can get to a place where these things can be net positive than harmful.
It sounds like from your point of view, it's very important that you have experts in these fields, like working in conjunction with the people who are creating like the AI algorithm and models as well, just to ensure like it's being done in the right manner.
Absolutely. And it's a really interesting time as well in product development and all these things. And I say it's an interesting time because things like, I'll use ChatGPT as an example because that's the most widespread, well-known one. They are not super hard to use. And so I say that because the industry of innovation now, the landscape is completely different. Whereas I can sit at ChatGPT right now and spend a couple hours and come up with like a really great prompt to do a lot of cool things, using my knowledge, and it's gonna come out really great. And that's because this stuff, this engineering, if you will, is like democratized in many ways, many ways. Whereas what I'm thinking about, like in 2014, when I first started working at Noom, if we were going to do something, it was like a lot of work. It was a lot of work and a lot of people. Like I had to, for example, I would have to like explain something, a concept of something, and then I'd have to give an example, and then I'd have to, write that down, and then an engineer or two or three would take that and try to translate it into something that's technologically whatever. The cycle between expertise to like working product is gone, like decreased by a factor of like 100. And so that's why it's an exciting time now, I think, even for different people in different professions, because now I think you're going to see this like expression of expertise come out in a way that hasn't come out before. So yeah,
Yeah, and like you said, the innovation is accelerating as well, which is
so
both
fast.
fascinating and scary. So the majority of people who would come to you, right, and you can totally, you're the expert here, you can say, no, Podge, like you're wrong. But I would say the
Yeah.
majority of people would come to you would be from a reactionary state, right? Something has happened and now they have to like process through or they need help. Do you see kind of this advancement in AI and technology? Do you think it can get us to a place of where we're maybe like predicting and being like creating preventative measures, like in particular, we'll say when it comes to like mental health, like is there a way that
Yeah.
we can be proactive in that space?
Yeah, I think we will be proactive. I think we'll be a lot more proactive. And there are already technologies now that are kind of impressive at being able to predict things that are related to somebody's mental health just using passive measures on their cell phone use. So, like how long you keep an app open, for example, can be a measure of, how anxious you're feeling that day or something. I don't know exactly how that works, but this concept is called digital phenotyping. And so I think you're going to see a lot more preventative stuff coming up. Now, where I don't know how it's going to get implemented in that, not everyone wants to talk to an AI bot or even a human coach. So for example, let's say, Podge, you as a, coach, I'll put my coach hat on as well. We're both coaches here at Heart. Let's say you called somebody every day and said, "Hey, how are you feeling? Are you feeling a little bit anxious today? Do you want to talk about that little anxiety that you're feeling?" No, they're not going to want to do that. And I think that like we do feel a little bit of anxiety, and we do feel there is like a very normal amount of stress that we should quote unquote are supposed to feel to function well. If we walked around all day long feeling zero stress, like at all, or zero arousal at all about anything, then we probably wouldn't get things done as much as we did, and things wouldn't be as exciting. And so I want to just say it out loud that like I think there's a healthy dose of all of this stuff. I think we'll get really good at predicting things a couple steps down the line and maybe being able to intervene faster using a lot of different modalities. I don't know if the number one modality is going to be, talking to an AI bot to help, figure out what the right thing to do is. I think it can look like a lot of different things for a lot of different people. But I think that in general, that when you get to the stage of actually talking to somebody, you're further along the line in that funnel. And you're actually, I think there's a smaller percentage of the population that I think wants to have that conversation, because don't forget, like behavior change is really, really hard. And I'm sure you're never going to forget that. Behavior change is really, really hard. And by the nature of how hard it is, people are really resistant to changing behavior. And so oftentimes it takes a lot of different things to do that. And anyway, it's super complex. I'm really excited to see where we go with this. But ultimately, we're talking about fun stuff. We're talking about helping more people in different ways, and that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a slight tangent, but you kind of mentioned about having a certain amount of stress is like normal and almost maybe needed as well. Do you feel we can't
Yeah.
handle stress anymore, or do we live in a world that kind of the message being signaled out is like you should like no stress? Do you know, I feel like has our
Yeah.
resilience decreased as a population in general?
I mean, it's weird because we live in a world where the amount of stressors are high. We have a lot of stressors in our day-to-day life. I don't know to what extent it's, they're just different stressors. I don't know to what extent they are compared to us like 500 years ago, because I think we were stressed out by very different things, back then as a population. Certainly today we're stressed out by a lot more, I think, complex things, just in the sheer nature of how much information we're exposed to, the demands of life. So it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell us now versus us back then. I can tell you that in recent years, especially over COVID, the world has been like the most stressed out it's been since we've been able to really objectively record these things. I think that when I say stress levels, there's this concept, there's this I don't know if it's a law or principle or something. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson law or something. I don't know if I can call it a law, but it's this idea or this hypothesis that they basically measure stress on an inverted U related to performance. So, and it's not stress, they call it arousal, but it's essentially, how stressed you are in certain situations. And what happens is like performance is not as strong when you're less stressed out. The more you kind of get stressed out or the more arousal you feel, your performance actually increases because you're kicked into some little bit of a higher gear. But then if you continue along that curve of arousal, then your performance starts to decrease because that stress is overpowering your ability to do what you need to do. So I'm not saying that we need to feel all the stress that we're feeling. What I am saying is that I think to some extent, we shouldn't alienate all kinds of arousal in all ways, shapes, and forms. And I think we need to find a balance that is healthy and that works for us. And I think that is really, really, really hard to find. So I can't say that we're less resilient as a population or as a people. I don't know the answer to that. All I'm saying is I don't think the ultimate goal in life is never feel any stress. That's all I'm saying. I just think that like it's too much stress is not great, and I think it's all about finding a healthy balance.
Yeah, I think there might be something being misconstrued between like if you experience any bit of stress, like you tend to maybe act on it, or people might say, oh, you should like see someone to get support as well. So it's hard to differentiate between like what is a adequate amount of stress that I should be feeling versus
Yeah.
like when should I seek professional help or something else.
Yeah. And I mean, I also think about like kind of going through grief and stages and all this stuff, right? There's a very natural kind of normal process that many people go through. And we are wired to go through that process in order to find some sort of healing. And most people do. Most people do come out on the other side of that with a different relationship with that loss. And I'll say loss because it's not always dying. It could be anything. But there is a percentage of the population that doesn't. And so for that population, after it's been, I'm off the top of my head, I think it's six months. I forgot off the top of my head what the sort of like when it comes over to more of a clinical diagnosis. I believe it's 6 months. Then for that situation, I would say potentially to do something a little bit more about. And that's not to say that if you're going through a hard time and you're dealing with a loss, you shouldn't get support. I think we look for support in when we're going through and there's something even powerful about this community is like we're finding this support from each other. So humans want support from each other, but this is all to just say that like there's a very natural healing process that we go to, and sometimes stress helps us through that in performance. Like imagine the Olympics now. There are Olympics going on right now. Imagine if like some of those Olympians felt zero stress. That might impact their performance. Now, if they feel too much stress, that will also impact their performance. But that's all. That's all I'm trying to say. That there are different levels of this stuff. So yeah,
Speaking of stress, I do want to be conscious of time as well. But like
yeah.
COVID-19, how did that impact the psychological field or like its future direction?
So COVID gave us some of the most interesting data when it comes to how stressed out the population was. Population was like the most stressed out it's been in many, many years. But I think the biggest thing that I saw that I noticed when it came to mental health is the influx of people working remotely. When I say people, I mean therapists working remotely. I as well am one of those people that, I don't have an office anymore. I gave up my office and I still don't have an in-person office. A lot of practitioners who were resistant to doing teletherapy are no longer resistant because they were forced into doing it and they were forced to overcome that stress that the idea of teletherapy and it turns out that the outcomes of teletherapy are just the same. There's no real difference in patient outcomes in person versus over something like Zoom. So I think it changed. I think it changed the world as far as access goes.
I always remember my I was at Noom since 2017, and I think we
Yeah,
were like Zoom's like biggest customer at one point. We
right.
were
We
such early
were.
adopters, and
They
COVID
they had
came
to make a
around.
new tier for us, by the way.
That
Do you remember? They had to
they
like create
couldn't
a
break.
3,000 person
Yeah,
group for us. Yeah,
they couldn't
or
break the
something.
1,000
Right.
people in a meeting or something, so they had to re-engineer the whole thing.
Right.
But my sister came to me when COVID started, and she's like, "I'm using this thing now. Have you heard of it? It's called Zoom." And I was just like,
Well, yeah,
"Yeah,
yeah, I remember when we like signed up for Zoom. I think it was 2014. It was really early days. But yeah, I know it's like everyone knows what Zoom is now. It really has changed, I think, the world as far as like connection and the adoption of these technologies. And I think that's also made us resilient, more resilient as a population as well. So yeah, super interesting.
Andreas, with a few minutes to go, what might be like a few key takeaways that you'd have for our listeners here, either when it comes to just psychology in general or kind of like the future of psychology?"
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm optimistic in the future if done well. And I think that, at least from where I stand, one of my kind of the way I think about it, one of my missions is to help shape some of this technology that is happening, that is potentially going to impact millions and millions of people. And I really do feel that responsibility to do that really well. And so I urge people to, if you're trying out technologies that that are trying to help with anything mental health or whatever, just make sure you vet it a little bit right now, because it is very much wild west. We haven't gotten to this like place that I'm talking about. There's still a long ways to go. We don't trust information just yet. But I think that it's not all doom and gloom. I think there are some great things that can come out of this, and there's a hopefully a something great on the other side of it. So hopefully that, I don't know, helps predict the future a tiny bit better than maybe before we started the conversation. But I think that's the
Yeah,
biggest takeaway.
yeah. So if I summarize the takeaway for everyone, it's be afraid, be very. No, just kidding. Yeah, I like
Be
I like the
afraid,
cautious
but
optimism. I
don't let
think
that
I'm.
stop you.
Yeah, I'm with you on that though. It's going to be really exciting, even over the next 5 or 10 years, to see what develops. And Andreas says, thank you so much for, I guess,
Yes.
being a big part of it. Thank you so much for being a big part of Noom as well. Like, this was most definitely a podcast bucket list for me. So it was an absolute pleasure
Oh,
to be able to
Podge,
chat
this
with
is
you.
great. I love this. It was so good talking. We should do this again. I really enjoy talking to you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. And for those who are unaware, right, you have your own show here on Noom Vibe on, is it every Tuesday it goes on?
Yeah,
Or
it's every
every
Tuesday at 11 a.m. So today, in a couple hours, I will be broadcasting my own show. So please join me. And it's called Ask the Doctor Anything, where it's just as the name implies, just come on and we can talk about anything. I mean, I might not be able to answer it, but you can certainly answer. You can certainly ask any question.
Well, you
So
did a great job answering my questions even before I asked them today. So I'm sure it's going to be an exciting one. Thanks so much, Andreas. An absolute pleasure.
thanks, Podge. Talk to you later. Have a
All
good day.
right.
Bye.
Take care. Truly fascinating conversation, especially when it comes to the future of psychology and how AI might play into all of that as well. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we will chat to you again soon, folks. Take care.